Welcome to the Gloaming Sleep Lab. Please secure your environment. Dim the lights. Adjust your audio output device to a low, comfortable decibel level. Tonight, we are departing the technical archive. We are initiating a field observation protocol. We will be reviewing the behavioral patterns, the motor skill development, and the energy expenditure cycles of specific biological subjects located within a standard agricultural outbuilding. There is no conflict here. There is no narrative arc. We are simply logging the movements of biological units in a low-stimulation environment. Let us begin the observation. The observation facility is a timber-framed structure ostensibly designed for agricultural storage, though its current operational status suggests a significant deferral of maintenance protocols. The ambient atmosphere is heavy with the particulate matter of dried alfalfa and the subtle, sharp chemical signature of slow-acting oxidation on old iron machinery. Sunlight is attempting to penetrate the eastern gaps in the siding, but the angle of incidence is currently too shallow to provide meaningful illumination, resulting in a gray, murky visibility that obscures potential hazards on the floor. We direct our sensors to the upper elevation, specifically a lofted area containing high-density, rectangular bales of straw, with a primary subject, a feline designated as Barbara, is concluding a hibernation cycle. Barbara is currently arranged in a tight, spherical configuration, a calculated posture intended to reduce the surface area to volume ratio, thereby preserving core body temperature against the drafty inefficiency of the barn's construction. She is not asleep, but rather in a state of low-power standby, monitoring the auditory frequencies of the environment for any sounds that might indicate a breach of her territory or the arrival of a caloric resource. The decision to terminate the rest cycle is not made lightly. Barbara runs a rapid cost-benefit analysis, weighing the metabolic expense of movement against the increasing stiffness in her lumbar region. She initiates the wake-up sequence by extending the left foreleg, engaging the retractile claws into the rough texture of the burlap twine binding the straw bale. This is not an act of aggression, but a necessary calibration of the tendon tension, ensuring that the weapon systems are functional should a conflict arise later in the operational window. She holds a stretch for a duration of 6 seconds, a period of time that feels administratively excessive, before retracting the limb and allowing her body to slump back into a semi-liquid state of lethargy. Adjacent to Barbara's position is a secondary, significantly smaller unit designated as Kevin, who is currently in the beta phase of his development and lacks the sophisticated software of the primary unit. Kevin is attempting to navigate the topography of the straw bale, a task that is proving difficult due to a disproportionate head-to-body ratio that compromises his center of gravity. He attempts a vertical rise, pushing up on trembling forelimbs, but the suspension system fails immediately, sending him listing sideways into the rigid flank of the maternal unit. Barbara opens one eye, the pupil narrowed to a vertical slit, and processes a collision not as an affectionate nudge, but as a violation of her personal zoning ordinance. She observes Kevin's uncoordinated struggle to right himself, noting that his traction control on the slippery straw is currently operating at suboptimal levels. Rather than assisting him, she watches with a detached, clinical interest, allowing him to gather data on the physics of friction and gravity through the harsh mechanism of repeated failure. Finally, Kevin stabilizes his chassis, blinking rapidly as if surprised by his own success. The rotation of the planetary body has advanced the angle of solar incidence, allowing a singular, defined geometric shape of light to project itself onto the uneven floorboards of the barn. This quadrilateral of illumination is not merely a visual phenomenon, but a thermal asset, offering a localized temperature increase of approximately 4 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the surrounding shadows. The dust motes, previously drifting without direction, are now highlighted in a turbulent suspension within this column of light, revealing the sheer density of particulate matter that the biological units are inhaling with every respiration. Barbara, from her vantage point on the elevated straw bale, observes the shifting of this thermal asset with a look of mild administrative concern, calculating the rate at which the light is traveling across the floor. She understands that to capitalize on this free energy source, she would need to relocate her chassis to the ground level, a move that requires a caloric investment she is currently debating in her internal ledger. Kevin, possessing neither the foresight nor the cynicism of the maternal unit, spots the moving patch of light and misidentifies it as a solid, physical entity that has invaded the perimeter. He stalks the sunbeam, crouching low with a trembling instability, his tail twitching in a spasm of misfiring nerve endings as he prepares to ambush the electromagnetic radiation. He launches himself into the center of the light, swatting at the floorboards with frantic paws, visibly confused when his claws encounter only wood and not the captured essence of sun. He bites the floor, testing the texture of the illuminated timber, only to recoil with a sneeze as he inhales a significant quantity of centuries-old agricultural dust. Suddenly, the acoustic environment is shattered by the grinding metal screech of the main sliding door being forced open along a rusted and unlubricated track. The biological units freeze. This is the arrival of the primary maintenance operator, a human biped responsible for the logistical supply chain of the facility. The operator enters with a heavy, inefficient gait, his boots striking the floor with a concussive force that sends unnecessary vibrations through the structural framework of the building. He is carrying 2 plastic buckets, the handles creaking under the strain of the payload, signaling the commencement of the morning caloric distribution event. Diane, in her stall, does not vocalize or express gratitude. She simply rotates her large head toward the feed trough, her expectations calibrated to the exact routine she has experienced for 3,000 consecutive mornings. She watches the operator approach, her eyes tracking the trajectory of the bucket with a dull, forensic intensity, verifying that the volume of the delivery meets the contractual obligations of her confinement. The operator upturns the first bucket, depositing a stream of processed grain pellets into the metal trough, creating a cacophony of hard impacts that sounds like hail hitting a tin roof. Diane lowers her head immediately, diving into the pile with a mechanical urgency, her lips sorting through the pellets with a dexterity that belies her massive bulk. She does not save a flavor profile. She is simply an organic processing plant, intake on one end, output on the other, fulfilling her biological imperative to convert carbohydrates into heat and methane. Up in the loft, Barbara hears a distinct metallic resonance of a secondary container being opened, the wet food canister. The sound triggers a Pavlovian override of her lethargy. The cost-benefit analysis instantly tips in favor of movement, as the potential caloric reward outweighs the effort of descent. She stands, stretching her spine one final time to lubricate the vertebrae, and then navigates the stack of bales with fluidity that is annoyingly perfect. She leaps from the second tier to the first, absorbing the impact with her suspension system, then flows over the edge to the floor, landing silently in a crouch. Kevin, witnessing the departure of the mothership, is seized by a sudden panic of abandonment, realizing he is alone on a high ground with no exit strategy. He rushes to the edge, peering down at Barbara, who is already trotting toward the food source without a backward glance, entirely focused on the logistical acquisition of protein. Kevin attempts to replicate her descent, but his depth perception fails him. He slides down the side of the bale essentially as a friction-controlled object, tumbling nose over tail until he hits the floor. He lands in a heap of straw and confusion, shakes his head to reset his gyroscope, and then sprints in a diagonal zigzag toward the smell of the food, his back legs moving slightly faster than his front legs. The operator has deposited a mound of gelatinous meat product onto a distinct, albeit unclean, section of the concrete floor near the tack room. Barbara arrives at the designated feeding zone and inspects the offering, sniffing it for a full 4 seconds to check for spoilage or unauthorized additives before committing consumption. She begins to eat, not with joy, but with a rapid, rhythmic efficiency, the sound of her chewing a wet, smacking noise that is amplified by the silence of the room. She crouches low over the food, her elbows flared out to create a defensive perimeter, guarding her resources against potential theft, despite the fact that the only other predator in the vicinity is currently tripping over a broom handle. Kevin finally arrives at the food source, crashing into Barbara's flank with the grace of a derailed train car. He attempts to access the sustenance, but his motor skills for eating are still in the prototype phase. He pushes his entire face into the food, inhaling as much as he chews. Barbara emits a low, guttural growl, not a threat, but a warning regarding table manners and the violation of her personal space during a critical refueling operation. She shifts her body block to the left, effectively walling him off for a moment to secure the prime cuts of the gelatinous loaf before allowing him access to crumbs. Meanwhile, Diane has finished the grain component of her meal and has transitioned to the forage course, a flake of dry, compressed alfalfa hay. She pulls a mouthful of the dried vegetation from the rack, the stems snapping and crunching with sound like dry leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. As she chews, a fine mist of dust and pollen is ejected from the corners of her mouth, drifting into the shaft of sunlight that has now migrated 3 feet to the west. Unit F7, the fly, having recovered from the earlier eviction from Diane's nose, detects the new organic aromatic compounds released by the wet cat food. It abandons the bovine sector and alters its flight path, buzzing across the barn with a renewed sense of irritating purpose. It attempts a landing on the perimeter of the cat food pile, but Barbara, without breaking the rhythm of her chewing, twitches a whisker that acts as a sensory tripwire. The fly aborts the landing, banking sharply upward, and settles instead on the handle of a shovel, observing the feast with compound eyes that register the world in a mosaic of pixelated disappointment. The operator, having completed the distribution duties, performs a cursory visual inspection of the facility, his gaze sweeping over the animals with a utilitarian indifference. He does not pet them. He does not speak to them in a high-pitched voice. He simply verifies that they are upright and processing fuel, marking the task as complete in his mental checklist. He turns and exits the structure, the heavy sliding door grinding shut once more, sealing the interior back into its semi-dark, dust-choked stasis. The acoustic seal is reestablished. The only sounds remaining are the wet chewing of the felines, the dry crunching of the bovine, and the low-frequency hum of the refrigerator in the vet room. The energy in the room begins to settle heavy and thick as the biological units transition from the excitement of acquisition to the lethargy of digestion. Barbara finishes her portion and immediately sits back on her haunches, beginning the arduous task of cleaning the residue from her face. This is not vanity. It is predator maintenance, the removal of scent markers that could reveal her position to a larger, theoretical enemy that does not actually exist in this zip code. Kevin, his belly distended and round like a tight drum, stumbles away from the food dish, the sudden influx of calories inducing immediate and severe food coma. He walks 3 steps, his legs heavy, and simply collapses onto the concrete, too exhausted to find a softer surface, accepting the cold floor as his new reality. The sunbeam continues its slow, indifferent march across the floor, now illuminating a patch of oil-stained wood that no one is currently using. The facility has now entered the phase of operation known as the postprandial stasis. The chaotic energy of the feeding event has dissipated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating lethargy that weighs upon the occupants like a physical blanket of wet wool. The primary activity in the barn has shifted from acquisition to processing, as the biological units divert their blood flow from the skeletal muscles to the digestive tracts. Barbara has relocated to a patch of sunlight that has finally reached the floorboards, claiming the thermal resource with a sense of entitlement that suggests she believes she invented the sun. She sits in a modified tripod configuration, her left hind leg extended vertically in a pose that defies anatomical comfort, resembling a crude antenna seeking a signal. She is engaged in a rigorous, detailed grooming session, a procedure that is less about vanity and more about the systematic removal of organic evidence. She extends her tongue, a specialized tool covered in keratinized papillae, and applies it to her flank with the rhythmic scraping motion of a stiff bristle brush. She pauses to bite at a specific tangle of fur, gnawing with localized intensity that suggests she has found a structural flaw in her own upholstery that must be corrected immediately. There is no joy in this activity. It is a mandatory maintenance schedule, a checklist of surface areas that must be sanitized before the unit can return to sleep mode. Nearby, the smaller unit, Kevin, has failed to secure a comfortable resting coordinates. He has collapsed directly on the cold, unyielding concrete of the aisle, his body sprawled in a shape that suggests he was dropped from a significant height. His head is resting on a small pile of swept dirt, a pillow of questionable hygiene, yet he remains in a deep, unresponsive comatose state. Every 14 seconds, his back leg twitches violently, a misfire of the nervous system as his developing brain attempts to run simulations of the chase protocols he failed to execute earlier. His whiskers vibrate, detecting the air currents, but his central processor is offline, rebooting after the massive caloric intake of the gelatinous loaf. Barbara glances at him mid-lick, her tongue arrested in midair, assessing his vulnerability. She determines that his location in the open aisle presents a tripping hazard for any personnel, but concludes that moving him would require an expenditure of energy she cannot afford. She resumes her grooming, effectively filing a grievance against his placement, but taking no action to rectify it. In the bovine sector, Diane has transitioned into the ruminant cycle, a biological loop of regurgitation and mastication that is as efficient as it is unappealing to observe. She stands with her weight locked into her skeletal structure, requiring zero muscular effort to remain upright, effectively turn herself into a table. Her jaw moves in a horizontal figure-8 pattern, a hypnotic, grinding rhythm that serves as the only metronome in the silence of the barn. Her eyes are open but seeing nothing. She is engaged in a 1,000-yard stare, looking through the wooden walls, through the timeline of the universe, focusing on a point of data that does not exist. A single strand of saliva hangs from her lip, lengthening slowly, fighting a losing battle against gravity. Diane does not wipe it away. She does not acknowledge its existence. She simply exists, a large war machine converting dry grass into body heat, completely indifferent to the aesthetics of the process. The atmosphere in the barn has become thick with dust motes that are no longer swirling, but seemingly frozen in suspension, trapped in the amber of the stagnant air. The silence is absolute, save for the wet sounds of digestion and the occasional settling creak of the timber frame as the building expands in the midday warmth. Unit F7, the fly, has landed on the rim of a plastic bucket high on a shelf. It is rubbing its front legs together, cleaning them with a maniacal speed, preparing for its next sortie. It walks along the rim of the bucket, patrolling a circle of blue plastic, searching for a purpose in a room that has completely stopped moving. There is nothing happening here. The narrative has flatlined. We are witnessing the peak of agricultural boredom, a stretch of time so void of content that it feels heavy, pressing against the eardrums. The sunbeam moves another inch across the floor. Barbara stops grooming. She stares at her own paw for 10 seconds, forgetting why she was cleaning it, and then decides that the task is sufficiently complete. She tucks the paw underneath her chest, assuming the low formation, tucking all extremities inward to streamline her silhouette. Her eyes close slowly, not with the heaviness of sleep, but with the shutting down of a business, a weekend. The observation continues, but the data feed has become a flat line of inactivity. The heavy silence of mid-afternoon is compromised by a sudden, unauthorized breach of the upper ventilation gap. An avian subject, specifically a rock pigeon designated as Gary, has entered the facility without clearance, navigating the stagnant air with a flapping motion that is both noisy and aerodynamically offensive. Gary circles the upper rafters, his wings beating against the heavy air with a frantic, rhythmic thrumming that disrupts the dust equilibrium we spent the last 3 hours establishing. He is looking for a roosting location, yet he seems incapable of making a decision, treating every wooden beam as a potential structural hazard that requires extensive hovering before a landing can be attempted. On the floor, Barbara's eyes snap open, the pupils instantly dilating from narrow slits to wide, black apertures to maximize light intake for target acquisition. She does not move her head. She merely rotates her ears like radar dishes, locking onto the frequency of the flapping wings with a military-grade precision. The presence of the avian unit within her designated airspace represents a significant violation of the lease agreement she believes she holds over this building. She pushes herself up from the low position, her muscles tensing in a wave that travels from her shoulders to the tip of her tail, priming the hydraulic pressure in her hind legs. However, she remains grounded. She runs a rapid trajectory simulation, calculating the vertical distance to the rafter where Gary has finally decided to land. The math is unfavorable. The target is located approximately 12 feet above the ground, a distance that exceeds her maximum vertical thrust capacity by a margin that is statistically insurmountable. Faced with this logistical impasse, Barbara begins to emit a sound that can only be described as a mechanical glitch. It is a rapid, staccato chattering of the jaw, a ek-ek-ek vibration that signals a fatal error in her predatory programming. She is frustrated not by the bird itself, but by the physics that protect it, viewing gravity as a personal adversary that is actively conspiring to keep her unfed. She stares at Gary with a burning, impotent rage, her tail lashing back and forth on the floorboards like a metronome set to a tempo of pure annoyance. Kevin, roused by the commotion, stumbles to his feet, his eyes wide and unfocused, completely misinterpreting the source of the excitement. He looks at Barbara, then at the wall, then at his own tail, trying to locate the enemy that has caused the maternal unit to vibrate with such intensity. He hears the bird cooing in the rafters, a low, resonant throbbing sound, but his lack of experience prevents him from looking up. He assumes the threat is ground-based. He adopts a defensive posture against a bucket, arching his back and puffing out his fur to increase his visual footprint, successfully intimidating absolutely no one. He hisses at the bucket, a tiny explosion of air that sounds more like a sneeze, convinced that the blue plastic container is the source of the intrusion. Meanwhile, Gary the pigeon looks down from his high ground advantage with vacuous, beady-eyed stare that suggests zero awareness of the danger lurking below. He shuffles sideways along the beam, his red claws scraping against the wood, pacing back and forth like a nervous middle manager pacing a hallway. He puffs out his chest feathers, preening in a display of vanity that is entirely wasted on the current audience, dropping a small, white feather that drifts slowly down toward the floor. Barbara watches the feather fall. She tracks its descent with a laser focus, her head lowering, her entire body quivering with the anticipation of at least killing this detached piece of the enemy. The feather lands 3 feet in front of her. She pounces. It is a lethal, perfectly executed strike, her claws hooking the white downy fluff and pinning it to the floorboards with excessive force. She bites the feather, realizes immediately that it has no nutritional value and tastes like dust, and spits it out with a look of profound disappointment. She looks back up at Gary, who is now tucking his head under his wing, preparing for a nap in the one place she cannot reach. In the stall, Diane has monitored this entire sequence of events via her peripheral vision, without ceasing her mastication for a single second. She categorizes the bird as non-edible and non-threatening, and therefore dismisses it from her reality entirely. She shifts her weight again, a slow, oceanic movement of mass, and exhales a long breath that blows a discarded feather across the floor. The excitement is over. The adrenaline spike has passed, leaving only the residue of unfulfilled hunting instincts and the lingering frustration of gravity. Barbara glares at the bird one last time, filing a mental report on the structural inadequacy of the barn's defenses, and then circles 3 times to lay back down. She returns to the loaf position, tucking her frustration underneath her chest, determining that if she cannot murder the intruder, she will simply ignore him until he ceases to exist. The planetary rotation has continued its relentless and inconvenient trajectory, causing the primary light source to dip below the horizon line of the western fields. Inside the facility, the defined geometric shapes of sunlight have dissolved, replaced by a creeping, uniform gray that signals the termination of the solar heating cycle. The temperature within the structure begins to drop at a rate of 0.5 degrees per minute, a gradient that Barbara detects immediately through the sensors in her nose leather. She expresses her dissatisfaction with the changing climate by tightening her posture, retracting her neck until her head is effectively merged with her shoulders, reducing her silhouette to a furry rectangle. She looks at the spot on the floor where the sunbeam used to be, staring at the wood with a sense of betrayal, as if the floorboards themselves have stolen the warmth. Conversely, the drop in light levels triggers a paradoxical energy spike in the secondary unit, Kevin. His internal chronometer registers the onset of twilight, engaging a hard-coded instinct for crepuscular activity that overrides his previous exhaustion. He stands up abruptly, his eyes dilating to encompass the entire iris, giving him the appearance of a creature operating under significant chemical influence. Without any external provocation, Kevin initiates a high-velocity sprint sequence. He launches himself down the center aisle of the barn, his traction failing on the smooth concrete, causing his rear chassis to drift sideways in a loss of control that he seemingly mistakes for agility. He reaches into the aisle, banks hard off a wooden post, and reverses his vector, sprinting back toward Barbara with a speed that is entirely unnecessary for the environment. He attacks an invisible entity in the air, leaping vertically and batting at a dust mote that exists only in his own imagination, wrestling with a ghost of his own making. Barbara watches this display of wasted calories with a heavy-lidded disdain, calculating the sheer inefficiency of expending so much energy without a confirmed kill or a food reward. She tracks his movement only to ensure he does not collide with her, treating him like a rogue piece of machinery that has slipped its gears. Kevin concludes his kinetic purge by running sideways, his back arched, attempting to intimidate a shovel that has been leaning against the wall for 20 years. The shovel remains unimpressed. In the bovine sector, Diane has decided that the structural stress on her load-bearing limbs has reached critical mass. The standing protocol has been active for 12 consecutive hours, and the time has come to initiate the complex logistical operation of lowering her body to the ground. This is not a simple action. It is a controlled demolition of posture. She begins by buckling the front knees, dropping the anterior half of her weight onto the brisket with a heavy, muffled thud that vibrates through floorboards. She holds this kneeling position for a moment, a half-collapsed bridge, gathering the momentum required to fold the rear suspension. With a groan that sounds like the hinges of a rusty gate, she collapses the hindquarters, rolling her massive rib cage to the side as gravity finally claims victory over her biology. The air is forced out her lungs in a long, resonant huff, blowing a cloud of straw dust away from her nose as she settles into the bedding. She is now a stationary object, a hill of black and white fur that has become a permanent feature of the landscape for the next 8 hours. She begins a rhythmic chewing of the cud once more, operating the jaw horizontally even while prone, proving that her commitment to mastication supersedes her need for sleep. The darkness in the barn deepens, the shadows stretching and merging until the individual corners of the room are no longer distinguishable. Unit F-7, the fly, sensing the drop in temperature, has ceased its aerial patrols. It has located a vertical surface on a support beam and entered a state of torpor, clinging to the wood with a stillness that suggests it has finally run out of annoying ideas. The silence returns, heavier now, weighted down by the lack of light and the settling to cool night air. Barbara, feeling the ambient chill penetrating her fur, looks over at Kevin, who has finally exhausted his battery and is sitting dazed in the middle of the aisle. She recognizes that while the smaller unit is annoying, he is also a portable heat generator operating at a high temperature. She emits a low, commanding chirp, a summons that is not a request, but a directive to assemble for thermal consolidation. Kevin, responding to command code, trots over to the straw bale where Barbara has remained stationed. He climbs up, his earlier coordination issues resolved by the urgency of the cold, and approaches a maternal unit. Barbara lifts her front leg, allowing him entry into the inner circle of her warmth, not out of affection, but to maximize the R value of their combined surface area. Kevin curls into the curve of her stomach, burying his nose in her fur, his motor finally spinning down to a low, vibrating purr. Barbara rests her chin on top of his head, effectively clamping him in place, securing the thermal asset. The transaction is complete. They are now a single, efficient heating unit, insulated against the inefficiencies of the night. The facility has now achieved total photon evacuation. The visual spectrum has been rendered obsolete, replaced by a dense, impenetrable obscurity that reduces the environment to a collection of textures and acoustic signatures. The only evidence that the barn still possesses physical dimensions comes from the subtle, rhythmic creaking of the timber frame as it undergoes thermal contraction in the cooling air. The wooden beams, having absorbed thermal energy during the daylight operations, are now releasing it back into the void, ticking like a cooling engine block in a display of structural thermodynamics. We turn our senses to the ground level, where the bovine unit Diane has entered the deepest phase of her sleep cycle. She is no longer chewing. The mechanical jaw rotation has finally ceased, bringing an end to the 16-hour mastication shift. She lies on her side, her neck extended along the bedding, a massive, dark hillock of biology that rises and falls with a slow cadence of tidal event. Her breathing is heavy and audible, a deep, resonant exhalation that pushes air through the complex baffling of her sinus cavity, creating a sound akin to a slow-leaking industrial valve. She is effectively offline, her operating system suspended in a low-power mode that prioritizes cellular repair over sensory input. If she is dreaming, she is likely running simulations of grass density and fence integrity, processing data in a loop of pastoral bureaucracy that offers no conclusion, only continuation. High in the rafters, the avian intruder, Gary, is a motionless lump of feathers, his head tucked beneath a wing to recycle his own respiratory warmth. He has become a part of the architecture, indistinguishable from the knots in the wood, a temporary fixture that will uninstall itself at the first sign of dawn. Unit F-7, the Fly, remains frozen on the support beam, its metabolic rate slowed to a crawl, waiting for return of the thermal energy required to reboot its flight systems. It is a dormant agent of chaos, pause in time, render harmless by the simple physics of the ambient temperature. On the straw bale, the feline thermal unit remains intact. Barbara and Kevin have not moved for 90 minutes, their bodies fuse together in a mutual agreement of heat conservation that supersedes any desire for personal space. Kevin, however, is currently experiencing a period of rapid eye movement, his small paws twitching against Barbara's side in a rhythmic spasm. He is likely engaged in a training simulation, chasing phantom twines and conquering imaginary bales of hay, his brain firing neurons to reinforce the motor skills he failed to demonstrate during the waking hours. Barbara feels these tremors against her ribcage, but does not wake. She simply incorporates the disturbance into her own sleep pattern, accepting the vibration as a minor structural inconsistency in the bedding. She emits a single long sigh, a release of air that signals the final shedding of the day's administrative burdens. Her ear twitches once, rotating toward a sound outside, perhaps a rodent in the walls or the wind shifting against the siding, but she classifies the noise as someone else's problem. She does not engage. She sinks deeper into the straw, her consciousness drifting away from the logistical demands of the barn and into the blank, static void of deep sleep. The barn is now a closed system. Energy expenditure is at a minimum. The dust has settled. The darkness is absolute. There are no more decisions to be made. There are no more trajectories to calculate. The biological machinery has been powered down. This concludes the observation cycle for the current operational window. We have logged the movements. We have noted the inefficiencies. We have verified that the system is functioning within acceptable parameters of boredom. You may now disengage from the data stream. Power down your cognitive processors. Release the tension in your skeletal frame. Accept the stasis. Good night from the Gloaming Sleep Lab. End of line.